Yeah, I think a lot of these are quite self-explanatory. We've talked about English, and we understand that people are writing in their second language, and we're aware that that's, you know, a huge burden. Like, if I had to write all these papers in Spanish, I would expect there to be errors. But basically, the kind of rule of thumb that we're looking for essentially is that we need to be able to understand your argument, and it needs to be sufficiently easy to understand that it doesn't take a disproportionate amount of effort for us to kind of guess at what it is that you could mean and then generously sort of say, well, we think it means this, and that would be sensible. It needs to be sort of fairly self-explanatory. If there's, you know, slightly strange phrasing that we wouldn't idiomatically say, but we understand what it means, that's totally fine, and we're not going to pick you up on that. We can work on that through the process. But if we just cannot easily understand what you're trying to say, then unfortunately you're going to need to take that back and work with a proofreader ahead of time, get a native English speaker to look at that work before you submit to that. There are language editing services available as well if you choose to use those kinds of things. Absolutely. The other issue is so there are other language issues. So, for example, we talked a little bit just before about sort of personal assertions and anecdotal work. That is often done quite weakly. That it tends to be like, when we encounter these problems, it's not like it's just one of these problems. It tends to be a couple together, I think, that have added up to us being like, this is unbalanced, a no from us. So sometimes we quite often get papers that are just like messy, descriptive kind of papers. And this is why we keep saying this word like analytical or critical. The point is that you are engaging in an academic conversation, that you are thinking about where your work fits in a larger body of literature. And if you're just kind of describing some papers that you've read and your work doesn't link to it, and it's all a bit all over the place, and you obviously kind of haven't sort of thought, how does this paragraph follow this paragraph? That's probably going to suggest that, you know, maybe this was the draft one that I referred to earlier, that this needs to go back, and you need to speak to your supervisor, for example, or a senior person in your department and get some feedback on this paper before you're actually taking it out to journals. The other thing that we see, and we have touched on this slightly, is just that the paper itself doesn't seem to have anything to do with what you said the paper would be about, which sounds like that wouldn't happen, but it does. So I don't think there's much more to say than that, really, but other than make sure that your abstract title and introduction have something to do with the research question. Yeah, and again, I mean, Carly Jane, you've talked about this already quite a bit, but as we say, there are papers that are submitted that kind of look like academic papers, but actually probably aren't academic papers, and are maybe more suitable for kind of an editorial context, you know, even quite a discipline-focused blog, but they aren't necessarily academic papers that we're looking for. And then lastly, publication ethics. So this is a huge term that means a lot of things. For us, initially, it means plagiarism. Like, we are looking at that, we take it very seriously. It's probably worth touching briefly on self-plagiarism, because this is a bit of a grey area, because some disciplines are totally fine with self-plagiarism, some countries are more fine with self-plagiarism than others. Our standard is that it is okay to cite your own work, and in some contexts it's even okay to use the text wholesale, but the only time that that bit is okay is really with something like your methodology. If you're repeating a methodology, we understand that there are probably not infinite ways of kind of describing a process, so we're okay with that. But you shouldn't be just using the text again and resubmitting it. That is not allowed. We consider that to be plagiarism in the same way that we consider it when you take it from somebody else's work. So you do need to be careful of that.
And just a note on self-plagiarism, we do understand, obviously, people will write PhD or master's theses, and you need to sort of transfer that into journal articles. And so in the cases where that is occurring, we do sort of look to see, has this been published in a scholarly journal before? Is this just in sort of an unpublished master's thesis that was from 2015 and no one has read other than examiners? We do take that into account. However, sometimes what I'll do when I see cases where I see phrases being repeated in multiple papers, phrases from a doctoral thesis that were repeated in another paper at a different journal, I'll sort of give you a revise and resubmit where I ask you to rephrase these things, as well as sort of give me in your cover letter a supplementary explanation of how this paper is making a different argument and a different contribution to other papers. And what you might want to do in your cover letter, if you think that you might have some publications that could come up, if you're really afraid of self-plagiarism, write in your cover letter to sort of explain, these are papers that I've written that are similar or on sort of based off the same research project, based off the same data. This is how this is different, and this is how I want to contribute to. If you write that in your cover letter, we do take that into, or I do as the managing editor, into account when I'm looking at.
Hi, and welcome to our webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about how to maximize your chances of successful publication with Elsevier's new journal, Social Sciences and Humanities Open. I'm here today as the publisher for the journal. My name's Lauren Ashby, and I'm here with my co-presenter, Carly Jane Stanton, who is the managing editor for the journal. So today, we're here to talk about, as the title of the webinar suggests, maximizing your chances of successfully publishing with SSHO. So the agenda will cover a few things. First of all, we want to debunk some of the myths around the editorial process and let you know what you should expect when you submit your work to the journal. As previously mentioned, talking about how to successfully publish. We're going to talk about preparing your manuscript to make a positive impact on the editors. And alongside that, we're going to be talking about some of the common errors that we see and how to avoid those. Last of all, we want to spend a little bit of time talking about how to write a powerful abstract, because this makes a huge difference to the impression that you make, both on the editor and also on the reviewers that your work is sent to. At the end of the session, we're going to be having a question and answer session, So if during the webinar you want to submit your questions using the chat function, at the end, once we've finished going through the slides, we'll pick those up and we'll answer all of the questions that come through. So get thinking. If you have questions that you want to add at the end, that's all fine. But this is an opportunity to get feedback directly from us. So please ask away. Okay, so we'll get started. So what is SSHO? We call it SSHO because the full title, Social Sciences and Humanities Open, is something of a mouthful. Essentially, SSHO is a new gold open access journal that focuses on research from across the social sciences and humanities. We're international, open access, as mentioned, and peer refereed. This year we have a discounted APC of $600, which will be at full price next year from $700, which is the total price you'll pay if you are accepted, and only if your paper is accepted. We accept papers, as mentioned, from across the social sciences and humanities. We have no particular preference to theoretical school, methodology, and we don't exclude anything that falls in the social sciences, whether it's quant, qual, whatever it might be. And we have a slightly different editorial approach. So we look at work for its methodological rigor and accuracy, which means that we don't assess work for what could be considered to be subjective measures, such as novelty or impact. So we're really looking for work that is fundamentally sound, well done, and accurate. That doesn't mean that we have low standards. It's important to be really clear about that. This is about looking for something different. And what that often means is that we do accept a wider range of papers than other journals might. So we take, for example, negative studies where you were set out to test a particular hypothesis and found that that hypothesis wasn't correct. We look at replication studies, for example, where you repeat a methodology or look again at somebody's findings. And we also accept more localized studies. So we don't necessarily expect work to have that kind of international impact that a lot of journals expect. So if you've done a study that focuses solely on one specific region or even a specific country, that's fine. And we're very happy to receive that work. We're also interested in receiving interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary work. So if you have that paper that doesn't sit very well in a more narrow, specific journal, then we might be a possible home for that, because we're very open to work that takes different approaches, and we're sort of set up with a range of editors across subject disciplines who can help look at that work. So I think that's kind of everything. Is there anything you want to add at this point?
No, I think that summarizes what we do pretty well.
Great. Okay, so I'll move on then to talk about what happens when you submit your work to the journal. So it's a three-stage process. more or less. The first thing is the review by Carly Jane, the managing editor.
So yeah, so I'm the first person that will see your work. I know that oftentimes submitting to a journal can seem sort of like a scary, faceless process. So part of this is just to be able to introduce ourselves and sort of demystify some of that. So I am the managing editor, and the first step in the review process is me taking a look at your work for some very sort of basic general standards. So first, I'm just making sure that your paper is in scope of the journal, which is pretty easy for our journal. As we said, it covers a wide range of topics, but if you happen to be a biologist or an engineer, I would desk reject yours just because you're not in scope. But if you are a social scientist or anyone in the humanities, that will be completely fine. But I do check for that. I also do, most significantly, a very thorough plagiarism check. So all submissions we receive go through Authenticate, which is a plagiarism checker. But I also go through and manually look at these reports to make sure that it's free from plagiarism, including self-plagiarism, which we'll get to a little bit later. And just make sure that you have sort of followed the ethical protocols in publishing. And if you have any questions about sort of ethical protocols in publishing, Elsevier has a very good module in their Researcher Academy to go through all of those guidelines for you. So if that's a question that you have in the back of your mind, please do check out that module to sort of make sure you're on the right track before you submit to our journal. I also do a check for English and to make sure that your work is readable. It doesn't necessarily have to be the most flowing, poetic work anyone has ever written, but it does need to be clear what you're arguing and free of very common sort of typographical or grammatical errors. So we're just looking for readability, not necessarily art, but I do check for that. And also, really importantly, I make sure that your research question or your thesis or your hypothesis, but depending on your background, is really well stated and very clear to a reader from a general audience, which is the readers of SSHO. So I'll make sure that it makes sense, that it's manageable in one paper. So sometimes we'll get papers with 25 research questions. And so at that point, we sort of suggest to maybe split those up into several publications with SSHO. But I make sure that you have a very clear research question that is explicitly stated somewhere in your introduction. And then just generally speaking, I make sure that it is well written, well sort of structured. We'll get into what we're expecting in terms of that. But just that it looks and feels and reads like a good academic article that was done carefully and with rigor and with sort of the proper citation methods that you'd expect in your discipline.
Yeah, I think essentially part of it is also just making sure you haven't sent us your first draft. When you're submitting to a journal, it's important that you've done a good proofread.
Yes.
Then checked for all the components.
Or a chapter in your doctoral thesis, if you're thinking about transferring those off into papers, make sure that you restructure it in a paper format. And so that's what I'm looking for as well, to make sure that this was written as a paper, as Lauren says, it's not your first draft, and that it was sort of carefully considered before submitting.
Yeah. So then assuming you get past CJ, the next stage is that you get submitted through to the relevant subject editor. So at the moment we have 12 different subject editors covered who all have quite broad remits. So they're able to cover kind of a range of subjects within their field. They essentially repeat a lot of the checks that Carly Jane has done to begin with, but they do it through the lens of someone who is a subject expert. So while Carly Jane is talking a little bit more in generalities, they're going to get a bit more specific. So if you're working in a particular methodology, they will be looking for the presence of particular elements. They're going to be taking a quick look at how your statistical analysis, for example, has been conducted to make sure that your tests are appropriate, those kinds of things. Assuming that they're happy with the papers, at that point, they go ahead and start shortlisting appropriate peer reviewers. Those could either be members of our editorial board, and for the most part, they're external peer reviewers that we identify based on their publication history. Then, once the reviews have actually come in, so we send everything out to a minimum of 2 peer reviewers, assuming that it's going to go on. If those decisions come back, so every reviewer that goes out is invited to make a recommendation about the paper, whether it should be sent for further revision, whether it should be accepted, or whether it should be rejected. Sometimes we get different decisions. So sometimes one will say accept, the other one will say outright reject. Then quite often we'll look for a third person to take a look at the paper to help balance that decision as well, to make sure that we're being as fair as possible in our evaluation processes. But essentially the subject editor is then going to be looking at that reviewer feedback overall and making a decision as to what happens to the paper. They would then communicate that decision over to the authors, who are either given a reject decision alongside some feedback from the reviewers, a revision decision, which could be major or minor, depending on the extent of the work that needs to be done, or in exceptionally rare cases, and I would say almost never, an accept. And I don't mean almost never in general terms, I mean in this first round. That's really important to clarify. So you should really anticipate that with any paper that you're sending to a journal, that you're going to be going through at least one round of revision. Up to 2 or 3, I think, is basically the standard, frankly. Oh, that's come up a little bit too soon. But yeah, essentially, it's going to then be a process of back and forth. So once you've made it through this kind of desk reject sort of checking stage, this first round of rejections, if you've made it through to review, you're probably going to be given a chance to build on the work itself, because generally speaking, the editors have decided that they think there's something worth developing. So I think here actually there's some really important points to make that are to do with how you respond to the information given to reviewers. And how you do that is really key. So one tip that we always give is that you should be really systematic about the feedback that you receive. So a common technique for responding to that is to go through your revision, all of the review information you've been given, and write it out, like each point in a list. And then you decide, you make notes on what you're going to do, because you may not necessarily agree with every single critique that's been made of your paper, and that's fine. But nonetheless, you still need to respond to that and engage effectively. Do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note for folks going through this review process that you're actually expected to submit a formal document as part of sort of your package of submissions to SSHO in your revision stages that directly addresses the authors. And so the best ones that I have seen of this have, as Lauren says, taken the review, which might be in point form, it might be in paragraph form, it might be a few lines, it might be very long. Hopefully it's quite long to give you substantial feedback to improve your work. But take that and per point by point, separate it and write, this is the reviewer's point, and then give a single line as to how you've addressed it. Don't think that the reviewer will be able to see that you've addressed their comment. They're taking their time out of their day to sort of help you with this work, and so be very, very clear and very careful about how you address those comments, and tell them how you've done it. Don't just think that they should go in and read your lines and make sure that that typo on page 6 was done. Tell them that you did it and put a quote in that reviewer response. And as Lauren said, some of the review responses you might not agree with. That doesn't mean that you just can ignore them and delete them. So make sure that in that itemized list of each reviewer point, you explain how you've addressed it, or if you haven't, what you think they sort of got wrong. And oftentimes, if a reviewer is making a point about an argument that you're making, or something like that, and you read it and you're like, they just don't understand what I'm saying, they're wrong. They can be wrong, but it also can indicate that you needed to clarify your argument or your point a little bit better. So read even the ones that you think are strange or sort of often left field comments. Look at them and read them through the lens of, how can I make my argument more clear? How can I make this sentence a bit more effective to prove my point? And then you'll find that that's a more generative process for you, and it will likely make it so that the reviewers in the next revision round go, oh, okay, now that you've changed that sentence, I completely understand that you were right.
Yeah, and I think this actually cuts to another point, which is that we understand that getting critique is not always the easiest kind of experience. And so I would always say, like, take a day, take 24 hours before you even think about engaging with the responses, because we all know when someone said something not very nice about our work, And I don't mean not very nice in terms of insulting, it's just that they may say there are some problems that need developing. It can be hard to hear when you spend a lot of time doing that, but bear in mind that this is always well-intentioned. It's designed to help you get a better publication. So take 24 hours, and then working through this in a systematic way does, I think, help you to be more analytical than emotional. And that's quite important. Knee-jerk responses that are angry and rude won't tend to get you a great response from reviewers, if we even would send it on, frankly. The other point that is actually also really helpful is sometimes we see authors just kind of highlighting paragraphs that they've changed, but not really indicating what it is. So you end up with this sort of, 16-page document that's just yellow. And that's not enormously helpful. So one thing that I would say is that highlighting can be helpful to be indicative of where changes are. But if you're doing it, think about including line references. And then if you're saying, I've made a change, please note the change is made in lines, 5 to 6 on page, whatever, which does this, and this. And that just makes it much, much easier, because it is very difficult to work out if something's been addressed. And so helping people help you is actually a really important part of kind of engaging with the reviewer process.
Yeah, and on that point as well, especially if you've taken several days to sort of process these reviewer comments, and you've addressed sort of the easier ones or the ones that make the most sense to you, and you're still having issues addressing some of these comments, perhaps you disagree with them, they were unclear, reach out to your subject editors who sent you the letter to ask for guidance. So I just today responded to an email from someone who was like, some of these reviewer comments are really unclear, I don't know, or in the cases where they disagree, like, I really don't know how to address these. And we are more than happy to help you through that process, offer guidance on sort of how you can approach the questions, offer guidance on sort of how much the subject editor is weighing each sort of point in their decision making about your manuscript. So if you really are stuck, don't do it on the first day, don't do it after the third day. But if you're really stuck on some of these reviewer responses, do feel free to check out or to email your subject editors and ask for a little bit more guidance in navigating them.
They're always happy to help with that. Okay, so we thought it would be helpful to spend a little bit of time, as mentioned right at the beginning, talking about what we expect to see in an academic manuscript. A lot of this is going to be very well covered turf that you'll be familiar with, but I would say, and I think Carly Jane, you can speak to this obviously more than I can, but it is quite surprising how often people get this wrong. And so I think it's always just helpful for us to cover it. We're not just going to talk about like what bits to include, but what it is that we're actually kind of looking for in each of these sections. So we're kind of going to go through the stages roughly in the order that they would appear in your actual paper. There might be some variation as to how you chose to document it, but roughly speaking. So starting with the title, I think this one is really important, right? Because it makes a huge first impression. We work with an online submission system called an editorial manager. So the first thing that we see when a manuscript gets submitted is its title. So if your title is not in correct English, or you've done it with weird, some of it's capitalized, some of it's not capitalized, there's characters in the middle of it that don't make any sense, you've spelt it wrong, it's not helping your case, because frankly, like Carly Jane is going to look at that and say, well, they couldn't even get the title right. I'm not feeling super optimistic about the abstract or the rest of the paper. And it's not that we are entirely biased by that. We understand that sometimes if you're submitting a manuscript, there could just be a technical error that you've missed something. Fine, we're not monsters. But I think it's fair to say that if you've been a little bit careless there, we are going to be checking that bit more carefully for how things have been done in the rest of the paper.
And also with the titles, we also, I think I have a slide on the titles, but also on these titles, make sure that your title is specific enough to address the questions that you're asking in your paper. So obviously right now we are dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. So don't just title your paper coronavirus pandemic. Title it something more specific, like how does the coronavirus pandemic affect food security in Edmonton, Canada. Something like that is a very specific research question that your readers, the reviewers, me, will know exactly what you're addressing as soon as we see it. And we'll also know that you are more generally being careful about your analysis, being careful about the conclusions that you're making, and want to express clear ideas throughout the rest of your paper. And it also helps you be found if you do get accepted. It helps when people are searching your work much later on.
This is, yeah, that's really crucial actually, and also true of your abstract, which it's worth noting we haven't included here because we're including it later. The other thing about title is sometimes people want to include quotes or something more creative in terms of that title, which is fine, but bear in mind that if that is your main title and it's a little bit abstract in the sense that it's not obvious that it immediately relates to your research topic, you are going to need to include a subtitle, which should be sort of indicated as part of your title itself in order that that is still there, because as Carly Jane points out, for discovery online, that's kind of thing is really, really important. So Carly Jane, do you want to walk through introductions?
Sure. I think we do have a slide for that.
Do we?
No, we don't.
I think we do.
Make sure you're very prepared. So your introduction is the thing that I read honestly, because our subject editors are people who will read very deeply your methodology, and they will read very deeply your discussion and your interpretations of the results, because obviously I'm not an expert in all fields. So your introduction is the thing that I, as a managing editor, read most closely. And so what we're really looking for is you're setting the scene for your research. And so we want to check to make sure that you are justifying as to sort of why you wanted to study this, as well as just a cursory understanding of what the scene is, of the specific case that you're looking at, of the research questions that you may have and why they're important, and that sort of thing. Lauren, did you have anything to add on that?
I think I was just going to take up your coronavirus example, because we ran a special issue call for papers, so we got a lot of submissions to that. And I think one of the things that came up a lot was this kind of excessive generality, right? So we've all been living with this pandemic for quite some time. So at this point in time, it's no longer necessary to say, in December 2019 in Wuhan, China, this happened. You can get a little bit more detailed, and I think that sort of speaks to the need to be specific enough. Like, you are laying the field, but say your paper, well, to take again Carly Jane's example about food security, how that's affected by coronavirus, you don't need to kind of cover everything about coronavirus, like including vaccine information and all this kind of stuff. You are talking specifically about how major events are going to affect food security, and therefore, like, what are those factors really that affect that? You know, is it delivery? Is it crop workers? Is it, I don't know what it could be, all kinds of things. It's not my area, but yeah, it's getting the balance right between setting the scene but also offering enough detail.
Yeah, absolutely. And making sure that setting the scene is in relation to not only the topic, but also the geographic region or the field that you're discussing. So if we're talking about food security in Edmonton, Canada, we probably don't need to be talking about Bangladesh or Australia or sort of all of these other regions, and how we don't need to know about coronavirus infection rates in the UK, for example. And so really, really thinking about in your introduction, and it's okay to go line by line and think, is this important information? Is this important information for my case? Is this important information for my field? And is this important information to express my research question? And making sure that it hits each of those, every sentence hits each one of those things will sort of get you on the right track. If you're starting to have sentences like, this is important for everyone in the world, or everyone experiences this, and all of those sort of grand sorts of words and descriptors, you might be starting off a little bit too broad, or you might be sort of overstating the scope of what you're addressing in your paper.
Yeah, that's actually really similar to a point we'll make about the conclusion, which is that you need to be realistic about the importance of your work in relation to a field or population. Your work probably does have some relevance to everybody, but that doesn't mean everybody in the world is going to read it. So keeping that in mind is helpful. CJ, do you want to talk about hypotheses?
Sure. So hypotheses, this is one of those things that obviously I work in qualitative methodologies, at least at this point, and so I don't work with hypotheses. And so not everyone is going to have this. So if you have interview data, ethnographic data, obviously, yeah, those sorts of researches, you're not going to be sort of stating a formal hypothesis because that's not epistemologically where you're coming from, and that's fine. But we did want to state, especially for sort of quantitative folks, some broad standards for their hypotheses. The most notable of which, for me, at least when I'm looking, is to not have too many. Obviously, especially with statistical tests, the things that you can measure with each hypothesis are quite limited. However, if we start seeing research question or sort of research papers with 25 hypotheses, it immediately flags that there are too many questions, there are too many things being tested in a single paper, and this should probably be split up into multiple publications. So I don't know, Lauren, if you had anything to add on that.
I think the only other thing I was going to add is just making sure that the hypotheses are actually linked as well. We have seen quite a few quite slightly funny examples, frankly, where the two hypotheses just seem to have absolutely no bearing on one another. You know, it's kind of like some part of it's about fruit picking and the other part's about trainers or something. You know, you don't, there's no kind of relationship at all that anyone could understand, and therefore it sort of undermines the validity of either part, which isn't to say that the research questions independently couldn't be developed into good papers, but together it just makes it look like you're trying to do too much that hasn't been very well thought through.
Absolutely. And I think what's really helpful to think about is having an overarching social science research question, which is, how does this phenomena work, or what is happening in this case? And think about your hypotheses as all relating to them and answering one dimension of how those things, of how your research question or the question that your research question is posing. And so making sure that they're connected together and that they all link up to logically connect to your research question, I think is a really helpful way of looking at your hypotheses. Yeah, and obviously, again, for qualitative people, this probably doesn't apply to you, but even so, when you're thinking about the way that you're formulating your argument or the concepts that you're using, making sure that each of them are sort of seen as a lens that overall addresses that research question is a helpful thing for, I think, all writers to think about when they're submitting a manuscript.
It's probably also worth saying at this point, we're talking a lot about the social science side of the journal. We do get the vast majority of our submissions are social science papers and not humanities papers. And obviously if you're writing a humanities paper, you don't pose the same, you know, you aren't writing in the same structure. You would never have, like, well, maybe in philosophy, but in general, you're not going to have a kind of hypothesis statement written out in numerical format, right? You're also probably not going to have results and data in quite the same way. So some of this won't necessarily apply to that. And we are primarily focusing today on the social science side of things. We hope to do another session that's more humanities focused at a later stage. Methodology, results and data, I think, are probably in, oh no, sorry, I'm realizing that the snake thing here is actually going, I'm reading it the wrong way around. I'm confusing everybody. So it is in the right order. So the literature review. I don't think there's that much to say here beyond it should be a critical literature review. That's probably the biggest thing that we see is like just a description of some papers in the area, which means that you either are reading too broadly and don't have enough kind of specific context, or the stuff that you're reading is really out of date. That's sometimes an issue. You know, if you're writing something about educational technology and the most recently cited paper in your lit review is from the year 2000, then probably that suggests that maybe your research is not going to be that relevant. And we have said that novelty is not like a criteria, but equally if your research is 20 years out of date, then it undermines its value in a very basic sense. So that's going to be a problem. Yeah, what else to add about literature reviews?
I just want to sort of emphasize this idea of a critical literature review as opposed to a sort of list form literature review. So it's not enough just to say so-and-so B and this person and that person have all written on this, literature review done, moving on to what I'm doing. We need to really understand what their contributions are, how you're interpreting them, and how they apply to your research question. And so you are contributing to this conversation that has been happening between researchers and between theorists. And we really want to see how you're engaging and how you're contributing, even if it's a negative result, even if it's a replication study, how you're contributing to that conversation. So if it reads like a grocery list, it's probably not comprehensive enough or critical enough, where you're really engaging not just with the abstracts of these papers, but the concepts that they're using, their findings, their discussion, all of those sorts of things. And I find that the literature reviews that read like list forms, when you get into them, you can tell, and you sort of follow their reference lists, you can tell that they've sort of only read the abstracts of a lot of paper to be like, I need to have a literature review. But remember that your literature review is meant to situate you not just in a group of people that have studied this topic, but situate you conceptually, situate your argument, and situate your contribution to the broader field.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so important. I don't think I have anything further to add, but it is just, it's a big tell, I think, often as well, about how analytically, generally, you've been thinking about your work and its place in the broader research question. Okay, so moving on to methodology. Obviously, this is going to vary quite a lot depending on what you do. I think here it's probably fair to say that this is one of the areas that we're maybe a little bit more specific, because we are a very generalist journal. We don't necessarily want people to do shorthands for their particular methodology, because I think it's really important that a lot of people from different communities could take a look at this paper. That's Absolutely. Sort of part of that multidisciplinarity sort of approach as well. So if within your particular field of study, there are certain conventions that people would understand, either by just a couple of words or referencing a person or something like that, you still are going to need to explain what it is that you did. And I think what we're looking for here is really the idea that you're being detailed enough that somebody else could do the same, that they could replicate your work. And if that information isn't there, then that's going to be, if it means that somebody couldn't fully understand what it is that you did, and maybe it doesn't have to be so that they could exactly go and find exactly the same thing, but broadly speaking, they should be able to visualize exactly the steps that you walked through in your process. That's really the kind of standard that we're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't be afraid, and in fact, especially with qualitative fields, you need to have references in your methodology section. A lot of the times, the papers that I unfortunately have to reject for plagiarism, this comes up in the methodology, because you sort of see another paper and how they have presented their methods. You just sort of copy and paste what they did because that's what you did, because that's the standard. But that gets flagged, that is plagiarism, that gets flagged, and you will be rejected on that basis. So really make sure that if you see a paper that does the same methods as you, if you based your methods off of them, that you cite them, and in more qualitative fields where obviously the idea of replication is a little bit more fuzzy and difficult, that you cite the people that are informing your methodological design, as well as your sort of epistemological approach, I think is probably helpful to note as well for qualitative papers. But yeah, especially for quantitative papers, make sure that you clearly define all of your sort of variables, the methods that you used, and make sure that you're citing other papers, even if it's an industry standard or a field standard. Make sure that you're citing other papers if you followed their methodology, because it's a very common error that, that folks, perhaps just because they're not familiar with citing method sections, get caught up in as well. So
yeah, that's really key. So results and data, I think I'm going to let you cover this one, Chloe, Jane.
Yeah, sure. I mean, your subject editors will be the people that help the most with this, because we're increasingly marching towards sort of all of our fields sort of falling open for us here, and that obviously the way that an economist will present their data on food security and coronavirus is entirely different than someone who does an in-depth ethnography on it. And so what I would recommend is know beforehand the industry standard of the subsection that you're submitting to. So when you are picking in that metadata thing, I'm a public health person, I'm an economist, know that that's who's going to be reading your work, and make sure that you're following the standards of representing your data and results that way. However, just generally know that your results section, is quite interesting for people. And so we really want, especially if you're doing an empirical analysis, we really want to get a feel for your empirics. And so don't be afraid to give us graphs, give us images. We can publish almost, I think I'm correct in saying
almost anything.
Yeah, we're online, so give us images, give us like lots of rich texture in terms of your empirics, not only because it's interesting as readers and your readers will want to do it, but it helps validate your findings. And so make sure you're doing that. Obviously, tables and sort of graphic representations are really, really helpful to succinctly describe what's going on. But again, don't be afraid to sort of give us your empirics, because it's what you put all of that energy into.
Yeah, this is a really good point as well, because we are an entirely digital journal, although almost any journal can do this these days. We can take supplementary data. So if it's a question of kind of finding the right balance, you want to be choosing the most important parts of your results to include here so that people can understand what the key findings were, and presenting those in such a way as to make that message as clear as possible. But if you want to include larger data sets, then we can also facilitate that. And we do encourage that really as well, because as part of kind of thinking about replication in social science, making data accessible is part of that. So we do have all of the tools in place really to facilitate that through the Science Direct platform. So if that's something that you want to do, if it's not clear when you're submitting, then you can always get in touch with us.
And just one final point on results. While at the same time we want to get a really good sort of feel for your empirics, we want to make sure your statistical tests were valid and used appropriately. Make sure that the results that you're presenting are directly related to your hypotheses and your research question. A lot of us obviously have very large projects where we're actually studying issues that are quite a bit larger than the things that we publish individual papers on. And so it can be tempting to start slipping in results for questions and from your larger project just because they're there, but really make sure that you edit your results section so that while you are giving a very broad, rich understanding to your readers of what your empirics are and what they show, those empirics only directly relate to your research question and your hypotheses and do not contain superfluous information. And that's something that I often, in my first sort of reads of papers, I'll go through and sort of do a check by check to make sure that these results line up. And if they don't, then that's where we sort of go into me sending it back saying, this is valid and I will send it to your subject editor, but can you please revise and resubmit with this sort of thing? So if you want to get over or sort of, not have to go through a round of revision with me first, I would suggest making sure that your results relate to your research questions.
We actually didn't talk about that too much at the beginning, but that is, if you get a revise and resubmit decision, then that's generally, you should take that as a good sign, because it means that we think that there's something promising in your work, we think it's interesting, but at the moment we can see that the paper is flawed in such a way that means that it will be rejected if we send it for review. So we won't tend to waste everybody's time by sending papers out that are just going to get immediately rejected. So do take the feedback that you get at that stage quite seriously, because we probably will, we don't definitely, but we probably will be pushing the paper forward after that if we think that you've taken into account the feedback that we've given you. Okay, so should we do discussion and conclusion together? So
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what to say here? We talked a little bit before about grandiose claims. I think that's really, really important. Like, be realistic about what your findings show. Be realistic about the limitations of what your findings show. Like, your paper probably isn't the be all and end all. It's an iterative stage in a much larger research project conducted between hundreds, if not thousands, of researchers across the world. So, you know, this comes back to like this understanding of where your piece of work fits. And thinking critically about that. It's also fine to recognize that there are limitations in your study, like what didn't this show, what in hindsight to some extent might we have limited ourselves with in terms of the methodological design, for example. So thinking basically analytically about the way that your work went and you're thinking about that afterwards is I think really important.
Yeah, I think that's a great sort of summary of what we're looking for. Make sure that all of the make sure your discussion and your conclusion are not just sort of rote summaries of what you've done, because by the time someone gets to your conclusion, they've already read your paper. And so your conclusion is really the point at which you can sort of draw together some of these arguments, draw back into that, the sort of discussion that you got into with other academics in your literature review. You really want to sort of bring those back together, see, and answer the question of sort of where have your empirics taken you? So you had these research questions, this is how you've answered them, this is how it contributes to the conversation that you started or that you entered in with your literature review. And your conclusion is really the point at which you can say, this is where this analysis has taken that conversation. And this is also through, as Lauren says, through discussing your limitations and things like that. This is where it can go next. And your conclusion in your discussion is also where, especially, we get a lot of papers dealing with very sort of applied research, which is really, really exciting and really important. And so this is where you'd want to sort of introduce policy recommendations and those sorts of things as well. And don't be afraid to put those in your papers. It does fall within the scope of our journal to submit things with policy recommendations, so long as they're not, so long as they're supported by your research.
Yeah, that is very key.
Recommendations should relate to your research question.
Yeah, and also have some basis in like probability, right? Like they could reasonably be done. I think we keep saying the word specific, but I think that is quite important. One of the things we see quite a lot in abstracts particularly, but then followed through in the conclusion, is people saying the paper then makes suggestions for future avenues of research, which is fine. Like that's fine in itself, but we'd kind of want you to be more precise in the conclusion. If you're just saying, based on this research, more research can be done, then you haven't really said anything at all. And so try and say something a little bit more specific. I'm really going to need some synonyms for the word specific soon, but essentially that's what we're looking for.
Yeah.
And then lastly, references. So we don't insist on you using any particular reference style. We don't, because we're aware that we're working across a range of social science disciplines and the humanities. People have different ones that they are used to using. But we do ask that you pick a style. So whether you want to use APA, Harvard, Chicago, modern languages, whatever you want to use, we're fine with any of those, but please do apply it properly. Be consistent and tidy. I think if you have a really sloppy reference list that is missing bits, is badly aligned, has weird spacing, stuff isn't italicized where it should be, all of that kind of thing, it just looks bad. Like, you know, by the time you're submitting, we are ultimately an international journal. If you're looking to publish at that level, we do kind of expect you to have sort of got the basics right. And like, you know, missing commas, we're not going to make a fuss about that, but you know, that can be fixed. But bigger issues than that, maybe not. And I think the other thing is a combination of both comprehensiveness and up-to-dateness, right? So if you've done a full academic paper, but you only have 5 references in your list, I think we're going to wonder if you've gone deep enough in terms of your thinking and your reading. There may be some variation on that if you're doing commentary type pieces, and we do accept that type of work, so there could be exemptions to that, obviously. And again, the out-of-dateness, you know, some of the journals that I work with, aside from this, will not accept papers if they don't have references up to and including the year of publication, simply because their field is so fast-moving that it would be inappropriate. You know that the work is essentially out of date if they haven't been keeping pace with the literature. We probably aren't quite as strict as that, but you know, there does have to be a sense of proportionality. If you're working on something in technology, then you're going to need to know what's going on. Now, if you're working on something that's more like history of science, then we could understand that not, you know, topics can be incredibly niche. There may not be that many papers published on this. So you might only have a paper that's most recent as like 2015 or even older, but it's going to be related to the field.
Yeah, and I also just want to sort of add to the reference list and in thinking about the balance between academic, scholarly literature, so things from peer-reviewed journals, and gray literature. So obviously things like reports, things from the UN, even sometimes, like at least in my field, sometimes people have like very good theoretical ideas that they publish in a blog or they publish in a more popular book. That's fine, but we're generally looking for the balance between those. And so if I look at a paper where many of your claims are supported only by sort of strange blogs that when I look up a keyword, it comes up the first thing up on Google. That's a red flag that you weren't doing sort of an in-depth literature review, and also that it's not necessarily a scholarly conversation. And so while we're not looking for things to be 100% peer-reviewed, 100% academic journals that you're citing, do sort of be wary of including too much gray literature, and especially gray literature that you could very easily, especially if it's just a fact, that you could very easily sort of supplement or substitute with a reference from a scholarly journal.
Yeah, that's really crucial. Frankly, we don't want to be spreading disinformation, and if it's too much, it kind of comes back to this larger question, like, which we'll talk about a bit more, but if too much of the information in your paper is like anecdotal or personal assertion, and then you're only really backing it up with kind of equivalent versions of that, it doesn't make for a very robust argument, essentially.
And honestly, it's also the audience that you're writing for, right? So if you are writing a piece and you're finding that everything is anecdotal and all the things that you want to cite are blog posts, then that maybe isn't a scholarly argument. And that's okay, but it doesn't mean that it's suitable for publication in SSHO. And so remember who your audience is, remember who is reading this, and remember what academic journals are for, and it's to contribute to scholarly conversations. So to do that, we need scholarly references.
Yeah. So on that note, we will move on to common errors and how to avoid them. We've probably covered all of our like top secrets already, but hopefully we have some new ones. So to start off with, we were going to talk about sort of writing and language issues. Yeah, I think a lot of these are quite self-explanatory. We've talked about English, and we understand that people are writing in their second language, and we're aware that that's, you know, a huge burden. Like if I had to write all these papers in Spanish, I would expect there to be errors. But basically, the kind of rule of thumb that we're looking for essentially is that we need to be able to understand your argument, and it needs to be sufficiently easy to understand that it doesn't take a disproportionate amount of effort for us to kind of guess at what it is that you could mean and then generously sort of say, well, we think it means this and that would be sensible. It needs to be sort of fairly self-explanatory. If there's, you know, slightly strange phrasing that we wouldn't idiomatically say, but we understand what it means, that's totally fine, and we're not going to pick you up on that. We can work on that through the process. But if we just cannot easily understand what you're trying to say, then unfortunately you're going to need to take that back and work with a proofreader ahead of time, get a native English speaker to look at that work before you submit to that. There are language editing services available as well if you choose to use those kinds of things. Absolutely. The other issue is so there are other language issues. So for example, we talked a little bit just before about sort of personal assertions and anecdotal work. That is often done quite weakly. That it tends to be like when we encounter these problems, it's not like it's just one of these problems. It tends to be a couple together, I think, that have added up to us being like, this is unbalanced, a no from us. So sometimes we quite often get papers that are just like messy, descriptive kind of papers, and this is why we keep saying this word like analytical or critical. The point is that you are engaging in an academic conversation, that you are thinking about where your work fits in a larger body of literature. And if you're just kind of describing some papers that you've read and your work doesn't link to it, and it's all a bit all over the place, and you obviously kind of haven't sort of thought, how does this paragraph follow this paragraph, that's probably going to suggest that, you know, maybe this was the draft one that I referred to earlier, that this needs to go back and you need to speak to your supervisor, for example, or a senior person in your department and get some feedback on this paper before you're actually taking it out to journals. The other thing that we see, and we have touched on this slightly, is just that the paper itself doesn't seem to have anything to do with what you said the paper would be about, which sounds like that wouldn't happen, but it does. So I don't think there's much more to say than that really, but other than make sure that your abstract title and introduction have something to do with the research question. Yeah, and again, I mean, Carly Jane, you've talked about this already quite a bit, but as we say, there are papers that are submitted that kind of look like academic papers, but actually probably aren't academic papers and are maybe more suitable for kind of an editorial context, you know, even quite a discipline focused blog, but they aren't necessarily academic papers that we're looking for. And then lastly, publication ethics. So this is a huge term that means a lot of things. For us, initially, it means plagiarism. Like, we are looking at that. We take it very seriously. It's probably worth touching briefly on self-plagiarism, because this is a bit of a grey area, because some disciplines are totally fine with self-plagiarism. Some countries are more fine with self-plagiarism than others. Our standard is that it is okay to cite your own work. And in some contexts, it's even okay to use the text wholesale. But the only time that that bit is okay is really with something like a methodology. If you're repeating a methodology, we understand that there are probably not infinite ways of kind of describing a process. So we're okay with that. But you shouldn't be just using the text again and resubmitting it. That is not allowed. We consider that to be plagiarism in the same way that we consider it when you take it from somebody else's work. So you do need to be careful of that.
And just a note on self-plagiarism, we do understand, obviously, people will write PhD or master's theses, and you need to sort of transfer that into journal articles. And so in the cases where that is occurring, we do sort of look to see, has this been published in a scholarly journal before? Is this just in sort of an unpublished master's thesis that was from 2015 and no one has read other than examiners? We do take that into account. However, sometimes what I'll do when I see cases where I see phrases being repeated in multiple papers, phrases from a doctoral thesis that were repeated in another paper at a different journal, I'll sort of give you a revise and resubmit where I ask you to rephrase these things, as well as sort of give me in your cover letter a supplementary explanation of how this paper is making a different argument and a different contribution to other papers. And what you might want to do in your cover letter, if you think that you might have some publications that could come up, if you're really afraid of self-plagiarism, write in your cover letter to sort of explain, these are papers that I've written that are similar or on sort of based off the same research project, based off the same data. This is how this is different, and this is how I want to contribute to. If you write that in your cover letter, we do take that into, or I do as the managing editor, into account when I'm looking at plagiarism checks and looking at self-plagiarism and what we're sort of willing to accept in that front.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Like, I think some people think that the cover letter is kind of not really functional anymore, but it actually is very important. So we do look at that quite closely. It's a space for you to, you can say things about your paper.
Yeah.
So,
just tell me about your paper. It's great.
Yeah, just tell us what
you like reading them. It's really nice.
It is very nice actually getting it. It's the most personal bit, I think.
Yeah, it's great.
For us.
No,
it can be a bit.
Yeah, and as Lauren was saying, and I rudely interrupted, and they do serve a purpose. They allow us to, they allow you to tell things about your paper that you can't necessarily say in the text, like how it fits into your larger body of work, more sort of succinctly the contributions it's making, or it's also nice to see why you're submitting it to SSHO specifically. So some people will submit us papers that they say, we're submitting this to SSHO because even though I've published in very specific journals in my field before, I'm really interested in this being read by a broader academic audience. And stuff like that is great to read. It helps us. It helps sort of create a lens in terms of how we're reading your work and how you're wanting to situate it, as well as sort of more technical things like plagiarism checks and stuff like that.
Yeah. One of the things I was going to mention as well is you talked, Kai-Jane, about like your MA thesis, for example, being online, or a PhD thesis, these kinds of things. The thing that we are generally going to check for is copyright assignment. So if it's your own work, but you've put it on a sort of an institutional repository, that's generally going to be fine, and we're not going to worry about that. If, however, you've published conference proceedings and you've assigned the copyright of your own work over to the society or the book itself or whatever you've done, we may have to be a bit more careful, because obviously we are a publisher. We can't republish material that now belongs to somebody else. So we do have to check that pretty carefully, even if it may not be super well read. And the same also goes actually for local language stuff. So technically speaking, you shouldn't really be, if you've translated work from your local language, it still has an intellectual property component that we would need to be aware of in terms of that. So it is worth saying, and if you have any doubts, you can always reach out to us and check. Yep. The last point to mention is that preprints are totally fine. So if you have your work on a preprint server, that's not a problem. We recognize those. They will come up in the plagiarism check generally, but we discount those. So don't think that just because it's online, we'll discount it. We are aiming to sort of further the open side of science research. And so we are very sympathetic to those. If it makes you feel more comfortable, it may just be worth mentioning it in the covering letter. So I think that's the main things. Just lastly, on the publication ethics thing, we ask everybody to submit a conflict of interest statement. So for example, if you have shares in a pharmaceuticals company and you're touting a drug, like that's fairly obvious conflict of interest that, you know, it's not relevant to this journal, but it's a good example. But there are sometimes cases like that. If you're selling, for example, a piece of educational technology and your paper is on that, then you do have a conflict of interest. It doesn't necessarily invalidate your paper, but we should be aware of it. So that's worth mentioning. What was the other thing I was going to say? So if you're doing research with people, we are going to be checking to make sure you've got the appropriate consents. And in some cases, we will come back to you for further documentation. So for example, if you said we got approval from our institutional review board, but we're a little bit nervous about your procedures, we may ask for the documentation of that. We may not even be nervous, it's just that often we have to cover our bases. So we'll ask for that so that we have those on file as well. So I can't cover everything on publication ethics, but if you have specific questions, then we're happy to answer those as well. So the next section is really more about technical presentational kind of issues. I think we covered
most of them just through our conversation, which is probably more interesting than going through a slide. So yeah, I think that this is I think that we've covered most of these.
I think we have, so we'll move on. If anyone has any further questions on those kinds of things, then again, that's fine. And then we've probably covered quite a lot of this.
Yeah, I think we have.
I think the only one we haven't actually mentioned is the tiny samples. So sometimes this kind of links to like overstating your findings, right? If you have done your research and your sample size is like 5 to 10 people, but you say, we think this is applicable to the global population, probably it isn't, at least not yet. So you need to be cognizant of that. And sometimes if your sample is really, really small, but reviewers can be a little bit critical of that. It's not necessarily a problem to have a small sample size, but it's probably worth clarifying why your sample size is quite small. It's going to be different if you're doing qualitative research. Like you can't sort of do interviews with 200 people, but if you are doing kind of survey-based research and you only have 5 people, how indicative are your findings going to be? Okay. So this is, I think, something, I know it's something very close to Carly Jane's heart. Because it makes such a difference. So maybe you should take the lead on this one, and I'll just put all the points up so that you've got that.
Absolutely, yeah. So the first thing that anyone, me, readers, anyone reads when it comes to your paper, and oftentimes the only thing that people will read when it comes to your entire paper that you've spent hundreds and hundreds of hours on, is your abstract. And so while I completely understand, and I think we both do, the desire at the end of writing a long paper after perhaps years of field work or data collection or analysis to just want to sort of slap something together and submit it, we really want to encourage you to really take the time and make sure that your abstract is good and that it's effective to do what you want it to do. And so what you want it to do is, I think we all sort of know and are told in sort of our programs and things like that, that it increases your readership, it gets people to click, gets people to read it. It absolutely does. That's really important. But from our perspective, what good reviews do, or what good abstracts do, is they get you reviews. And so this means that good reviews will have faster editorial processes, holding all other things constant. So if I have a paper on food security in Edmonton and the coronavirus crisis with a really good review and one abstract and one with a really bad abstract that doesn't say what it's going to do, that's poorly written, I'm going to have, as an editor, it's going to be much quicker and much easier to find reviewers for the paper, the identical paper with a good abstract, than the one with a bad abstract. So it's really, really important, especially, obviously, people want their research published as quickly as possible. It's really important to help us help you with that. And one way that you can do that is writing a really good abstract. So you basically want to make sure that all of the sections we've gone through in the webinar so far are represented in your abstract. Your reviewers should be able to read it, know why you studied what you did, know what your research question is, know your methods, know your theoretical framework, know your results, and know very broadly why you think that they matter. And so we have a guide on, like a more detailed guide on how to do an abstract up on our website, or we will soon. to help you with this, but very broadly, we want to make sure that you have sort of a brief 1 to 2 sentence summary of sort of the background in your research question. So you need to take that entire introduction that you wrote and all of those hypotheses and fold that down into the most critical information in 1 to 2 sentences. Don't do more than this. Really, really long, like your abstract should not be longer than probably 500 or 600 words. And even that is a very long abstract.
Yeah.
It should be probably between 250 to 400. So you need to really, really be concise and be very clear in every part of it, but make sure that the summary and this research question are very clear and just front loaded at the beginning. And this is the most critical time to make sure that words like everyone, all over the world, the globe, all of those things, do not put them in your abstract. It is wasting space and is going to put off potential reviewers. Make sure that you make some sort of mention of your theoretical or conceptual framework in your abstract. This tends to be a bit more important in people doing sort of critical qualitative work or work in sort of, often it comes up in sustainability and areas like that, where there are so many different conceptual frameworks or so many theorists who sort of have completely different epistemological approaches to questions. And so a lot of the times reviewers will look at an abstract and say, well, I studied the topic of food security in Edmonton, but you are using Deleuze, or I don't know if you're using Deleuze or Foucault, and so because of that, I don't want to even approach it. And so be clear about the theoretical approach you're using, just so reviewers can know whether or not they want to or can comment on your work, and also to make sure that you're not getting a Deleuzian commenting on a incredibly structuralist paper or something like that. You also want to mention your research design and your methods. So mention your sample size, mention broadly the statistical tests that you used, but don't include superfluous information. So if you did a survey, don't mention every single person that you sent it out to and how many rounds of whatever. Save that for your methodology section. Just put your sample size. You don't need to include things like your data software. So if you used NVivo, if you use SPSF, Stata, you don't need to write that in your abstract. You can save that for later. It's not critical core information, but you do want researchers to be able to look at it, know your sample size, know what you did, just so they can match on to see if that's the types of methods that they use and whether or not they can comment on it. Briefly mention your results, so no more than sort of 2 to 3 sentences there, really, really distilling it down into the core results that directly relate to your research question. And finally, no more than 1 or 2 sentences about the implications, because that is obviously sort of fleshed out in the paper itself. The most common sort of errors that come up in abstracts, and oftentimes, I think the most common reason that I will send the paper back as a revise and resubmit before sending it off to a subject editor is because of these errors in the abstract, just because I know it means that it won't be a smooth review process for you, is that your abstract is really long, or that it's too short. So simply saying this paper studies food security is not enough and will not help people, or giving sort of an entire history of what that word means also is not going to be helpful. So it's often that it's too long, too short. Really try and keep sort of in sort of the range of, I don't know, between 300 to 500-ish words is pretty good for most fields. Oftentimes the people will literally copy and paste their introduction into the abstract sort of metadata component of our sort of editorial manager thing. So they'll just make their abstract the first however many words is allowed of their introduction. So
this is a very bad move on so many levels.
So please don't do that, not only because it sort of indicates to me that you didn't put a lot of effort into the submission, but also it's just not helpful because the first 2 paragraphs of your introduction does not give the reader all of the information they need, and it doesn't give the reviewer the information they need to decide whether or not they want to review your paper. So really make sure that you don't do that. I know that it can be incredibly tempting just to do it, but it's an introduction is not the same thing as an abstract.
It's really more like your elevator pitch, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one really helpful way of looking at abstracts is that they need to be able to be read and comprehensible and communicate an idea. as a standalone document to your article. And so what I and other sort of writers find very helpful is writing an abstract and then sending that to someone both sort of at the undergraduate level, someone at a grad school level, and someone at sort of a senior academic PhD level, and making sure that to each of those people, because obviously many people read your abstract across all sort of different levels of academia, making sure that they're able to sort of comprehend what's going on in your paper and making sure that they are able to comment on each section. So they're able to say why you did it. They're able to say what your framework is. They're able to say what your research design was and what your results were. So sending it off to people who haven't read your paper, who are not familiar with your work, and saying, do you know what I did? Is a really, really helpful way to making sure that your abstract works alone, separately from the rest of your paper, in sort of convincing people that your research is worth reading and reviewing. And then finally, obviously, just making sure that your abstract, not more, but it's as equally as important that your abstract is like crystal clear, very well written in very sort of concise, clear language, because it indicates to reviewers how careful or how sloppy you are in the rest of your paper. And so really, really think of your abstract as the thing, your pitch, as Lauren says, your pitch to not only your readership once you're published, but in the editorial process, your pitch to me, your pitch to your subject editor, and your pitch to your reviewers to encourage us to sort of continue with this editorial process. Do you have anything to add to that, Lauren?
I was just going to say, I think it's a really interesting perspective, the idea that you're selling it to your reviewer. And I don't think we often talk about it in those terms, right? Because why do people choose to peer review? Part of it is community service, it's a desire to help. But there is also an aspect that, you know, if you're working in a field, you want to understand what other people are doing in that area. And so, you know, how motivated are you going to be to spend your time looking at papers that the abstract either doesn't really make any sense, appears to indicate that the paper is probably not going to be very interesting to them, or just doesn't make any sense at all. Mm-hmm. It is part of that process. Like, you know, I'd be more inclined to read really good work that you can help develop, and then also may have some kind of reciprocal benefit for you, as well as you doing the kind of help to the author. And I think that's quite crucial. The other thing is, I think we didn't mention that you probably should avoid having references in your abstract. That's like, if you have to, then okay, but 1 is probably your upper limit, maybe 2 if an absolute stretch. The other thing I was going to mention is we've talked about this kind of like, it should be readable by different audiences. And one of the things we also allow, although this doesn't go to reviewers, this is just for the publication side of thing, we do allow authors to do highlights. And a lot of the same things apply there. So we often see quite badly written highlights that don't really tell you what it is that the paper does. They're just, you know, they take lines out of the results that don't necessarily stand alone that well, for example. And I get, again, it's like an extra thing that you had to do after all of this work. But the reason that we include highlights, the reason that that exists as a concept in on these kind of platforms that publish scientific content, is that if you want your work to be discovered by non-specialist audiences, for example, by journalists, if you want it to be comprehensible by press offices, if you want it to be more relevant for policymakers who don't necessarily have a fully academic background, but will be well versed in the issues, that's where those really come into their own. And so that's kind of worth thinking about as well. And the last point is, we haven't focused too much on this today because it's not a pitfall in terms of getting published. But abstracts also, when you actually publish your paper, are about making your paper discoverable. And so making sure that your keyword phrases are kind of appearing as part of that is a really crucial part of making sure that if your paper has got, you know, you've worked really hard, you've got through peer review, you've been accepted and published, it's going to be a bit disappointing if you get like 3 downloads a year, right? Especially in an open access journal, that would suggest that you made a few mistakes and probably we wouldn't have accepted it. But assuming that those things aren't true, you know, how do we look for literature these days? How do you actually go about searching for the content that is relevant to your research project? A lot of people are actually starting with Google Scholar these days. And so keywords for that search engine optimization is really important. We could maybe talk about that in a different webinar later on. But I think we've kind of covered everything we planned to. So we're going to kind of start going through the questions now. So there's going to be a pause while we take a few minutes just to kind of gather our thoughts, start with the questions, and if you could just hang on, we'll be back online. So please bear with us.
So, Lauren, I can't hear you. Can you hear me? Great.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes. Sorry, everyone. Being competent there. So we got loads of questions. We will just keep an eye on the question box as we go through. So if you have any last ones that you didn't get a chance to type in yet, or if something comes up now, then just let us know. So we'll go through. Just one point to start off with. So I know some of you have been asking about the webinar code so that you can get your certificate on Researcher Academy. I have put that in the announcement box over to the side, so you should be able to see that, but it's YYQPPX, if anybody can't see that for any reason. That's YYQPPX. I feel like I'm announcing planes. Okay, so right, to go through the questions. Oh yes, well the other point I was going to make is a few people sent in really specific questions about their manuscripts. In those cases, we're not going to address those particular questions because they're just too specific.
Yeah.
And to be honest, we'd need to see your abstract to actually answer the question. So if you want to send those through to us, the email address is sshoeditorial@elsevier.com. All the details are on the journal website if you didn't catch that. But yeah, for specific, very, this is my manuscript, can I submit it? Please send that to us. We can't address that here. Okay, another question we got a lot of was, are there discounted APCs for researchers from low or middle income countries? And the answer is yes. Elsevier is part of Research for Life, which means that we do support the discounts that they endorse. To check if your country is eligible, you need to go to the Research for Life website. There are basically two lists. If your country is in list A, then the APC is waived entirely. If your country is in list B, then I think it's 50% discount on the APC. So the short answer is yes. And again, any specific questions, please let us know before you submit rather than after, so that we can answer that question to you. Okay. So
I've seen that we've seen a number of questions about acceptable English, and we did go over that pretty thoroughly. So maybe some people, when the recording ends up online, you can sort of look through that part of it again. But we specifically got a question about whether or not we're looking for formal UK English, and the answer is no to that. We're looking for readability. So this is not, as I mentioned earlier, we're not looking for art. We're not looking for a beautiful piece of literature. We're looking to make sure that it's your English is just comprehensible, and we can help with if it's almost comprehensible or there's just a few issues. We can definitely help you. And oftentimes, what we'll do is if your paper otherwise looks good, but it's really, really difficult to read, we'll do a revise and resubmit and just suggest that you get a proofreader. So we're absolutely not looking for perfect UK English. That's not what we're looking for, but we're making sure that we can understand your arguments and understand what you're trying to say. So.
Yes, exactly. I'm just seeing a load more questions coming in about the certificate. So for the certificate, it's on Researcher Academy website. So I think some of you came via Bright Talk, but you should still have a link from Researcher Academy from when you first registered for the workshop. So please go there for that. Sorry. Okay. So next one, conference proceedings. The short answer is probably ask specifically, because it's very context dependent, and it basically comes down to that point about copyright. If you've assigned copyright, then no. But there are lots of grey areas, so you may want to check on that.
We had a question about our plagiarism reports and sort of what percentage counts as plagiarism, and it completely depends. And that's because while we do put it through Authenticate, I manually check every single paper, because a lot of times what we get are some authors that know that it's going through a plagiarism checker, and so even though they're copying significant bodies of work, they'll just use synonyms in some points to sort of try and trick the plagiarism checker. And so I manually look for those things. So if you are sort of thinking that you might be marginal, really do check out the ethics module on Researcher Academy to look at what our standards are sort of across the publisher and what's acceptable in academic publishing. So yeah, there's not a specific percentage because it's a combination of the report and manually done.
Yeah. But I would say that if you're above like 25%, we're probably going to be a hard no.
Yeah.
But there's a grey area depending on
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So the next, oh, sorry, yeah, speed, go for it.
So speed, so yeah, so time to first decision is about, it varies by paper, but I'd say on average it's 3 to 4 months for that first decision. For further rounds, it really depends a bit on like how long you take to revise your manuscript and whether you did what the editor asked you to do in that process. So yeah, so about 3 to 4 months.
Great. We have a question about sort of narrative analysis and interviews. Again, that's sort of quite a specific question, but we got a few of them about those sorts of things. And so with qualitative data, I would just say that to sort of look into the standards of the methods of the papers that you're wanting to submit. So look at other people who have used those methods. But very broadly in qualitative research, triangulation is helpful. So while that specific method may not involve interviews in your paper, you may want to incorporate multiple methods so that you can have a more robust empirical evidence for your findings.
Exactly. Reject and resubmit. So we got a question about sometimes we give the decision type reject and resubmit, which is different to a revised decision. A reject and resubmit is usually given when we think a paper has potential, but we just know that if we send it for review right now, you're going to get a no, or that we're not going to be able to get any reviewers because of the condition that the paper's in. So generally, if we've sent that, we'll probably make some quite specific remarks about why it is that we have a problem with the paper in its current form, but we're also telling you that we like it, and we are encouraging you to bring it back. But it is different to a revised decision, partly because usually the changes that we require are just a bit more fundamental. So we'll ask for that to be coming in as a new paper. So you've got a couple of questions on Scopus. So we're a really new journal. So this is something that is often a bit of a misconception amongst academics. Just because it's an Elsevier journal doesn't mean that we automatically get into Scopus or any index. It takes time. It usually takes sort of between 1 to 2 years for those processes to actually happen, depending on what's being published and the citation levels that those papers are getting. So no is the answer for the moment. We are not in Scopus, but we do intend to be in Scopus once we've published enough content. So as I said, we are a very, very new journal.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then Lauren, we got a question about replication studies, but I think, and also relatedly, some questions about review articles and things like that. So maybe a quick overview of the types of stuff we're looking for.
Sure, that's a good point. So replication studies. So we got a couple. So we do accept replication studies. What a replication study is usually looking at a piece of research that's been done and testing it in a new context, basically to extend the applicability and the validity of that original piece of research. There are lots of different ways in which that could be the case, but broadly speaking, that's how we would understand it. We also take case studies. So by case studies, we're talking about things that are maybe that little bit more localized. So rather than it being kind of on a grand scale of looking at multiple countries, if you've done something on your home city, that would be okay. A lot of international journals won't take that because it's too narrow. We will. Review papers, yes, very welcome to send in review papers.
Great.
Yeah.
So we got a number of questions about introductions, literature reviews, conclusions, all that sort of thing. So one was the difference between the introduction and your literature review. Just broadly speaking, your introduction is sort of setting the sort of scene for your research. It's where you present your research questions. It's where you present sort of the context that's necessary for people to understand the topic. And your literature review is where you're really, really going into what academics have said conceptually and also empirically about the topic. And so while of course you'll have citations in your introduction, the literature review is meant to be that sort of critical conversation between academics and academic sources. We got another one on revisiting your literature from the literature review in your conclusion. And I would say that that's a good thing to do, so long as your commenting on how your analysis has contributed to the conversation that you've outlined. So if you work with authors, you can revisit that, but say, oh, like this debate that I was talking about in the literature review, this is what those people said. Saying this is what those people said and this is how this contributes is exactly what you should be doing in your conclusion, so long as it's not a sort of exact copy of your literature review. And then
kind of
more about sort of combining sections based on our little snake that we had. Our little snake is not a hard and fast representation of what your paper structure looks like. So if you feel as though, or it's more common in your discipline to combine results and discussion, or just do that. Yeah, this was like a very broad representation of generally what we're looking for, but of course there'll be variation, and we would not sort of reject you based off of something like that.
No, and so probably at the same time, we've had a few questions about, do I have to have a hypothesis? And again, no, that's not applicable to your type of work. And we also, so as we said at the beginning, this webinar is quite focused on kind of social science and empirical research. We do, as a journal, accept different types. So theoretical, we got a question about types of work in legal research, so doctrinal research. Again, that is fine. It will be sent to reviewers who are appropriate for your field. We will be doing further webinars in due course that will be focusing much more on the humanities side of things and what the expectations are there, but also looking at more like theoretical papers and how to kind of make sure that you're doing the right things on those sides. So all of those sort of come in here. I'm jumping about a bit, which may make our questions confusing.
We got a number of questions on sampling. So on both sample size was one, and whether or not those expectations are the same in quantitative and qualitative research. They're absolutely not. You should be looking at studies that are using similar methods to you to see what the standards are, and also being able to justify your sample size if that's necessary, using appropriate literature. We got a question about citing regarding sampling and sort of what we expect. Specifically, we should know your sampling technique in both quantitative and qualitative research. So you should outline that in your methods section. Generally speaking, we don't need a lot of citations on your sampling methods, especially if they're sort of standard. But if you do have a small sampling size or sample size, if you did use sort of out there techniques or something that sort of leaves the norm in any way, then you should be citing things. So it really is case dependent, but generally speaking, you should be able to sort of explain how you sampled your population and give a good sort of justification for your sample size in both quantitative and qualitative research.
Yes. We got a couple of papers about finding the right journal for your work, which is a really good question. There are lots of different ways. I mean, you'll get more confident on this point as you become a more established researcher, essentially, and you'll know kind of where your audience really is. The easy answer is, who are you citing? Like, who are you reading? Who are you citing? And where are they publishing? That's probably a really good starting point. Go and look at those journals, read their aims and scope. And please, please, please read the aims and scope, because although SSHO is super broad, most other journals are not, and get quite cross if they get papers that have nothing to do with their field. The other thing to do is, so Elsevier has a tool called the Journal Finder tool. So if you just Google Journal Finder, you can enter in your title and your abstract of your paper, and we will recommend journals, but it will only recommend Elsevier published journals. So if you, that obviously it's quite a lot of journals, but it's a small portion of the global possibilities. So other publishers will have the same. So Wiley and TNF have kind of similar equivalents. Go and look there. But really it's about looking at where you're finding your work, because that is going to be your area. And then there's always big broad scope journals like this one, and there are other journals like this one who will cover a wide range of topics.
We got a question about non-English data. So of course, many of our researchers do interviews in languages other than English. That's completely okay. And presenting that, generally speaking, we would like that to be translated in English if it's entering your paper. So it's nice to have both the sort of local language or the language that the interview is conducted in, as well as the translation below when presenting it. And I think there was specifically a question about student answer sheets. So translation would be good, but obviously make sure that you have the appropriate consent for things like that to be released and included in publications before you put them in your paper. So.
Perfect. Great.
Sorry. Oh, sorry, we had another one. I'm just running through. We had another one about whether or not it's necessary to have references from SSHO in your article submitted to SSHO, and absolutely not. Of course, we would love if you are reading and citing papers that we've published, but if your field has no paper, we're a very new journal, so there's a chance that you'll be the first person in your field publishing with us. And so absolutely not. You should cite the people that are appropriate to cite, and that should be determined not necessarily in the journal that they're publishing in or where your editors have published it in. No, you shouldn't make those decisions based on that. You should make it based off of the scholarly content of the article.
Yeah, I think the only thing that should ever make you cite the previous work in a journal is if that journal published all the definitive papers on your area. Yeah. And if you've missed those, it's not going to look great. Yeah. But there should be no mandatory expectation that you're publishing. Just if someone says, please cite, we sometimes see reviews that kind of say things like, this paper would be better if it cited all of my work. Yeah. We will probably even remove that because it's unethical, frankly, to suggest that. So no is the very definite answer there. We had a follow-up question on grey literature. So if your paper is brand, so certain topics, so there was a question specifically about sexual harassment in the workplace, was the example given. Grey literature is fine, to be clear. It just shouldn't be the only thing. Yeah. So there's clearly going to be, work on previous cases, on attitudes, blah, blah, blah. There is going to be academic literature. If you've missed all of that altogether, then that's probably going to be a bit of a gap.
Yeah, we have no expectation that everything is scholarly, and of course, especially in my field, actually, I end up citing a lot of grey literature because not everyone that is, not everyone publishes everything that interesting that they've written in scholarly journals, and so that's not an expectation that everything is, and of course, it's context dependent based off of the field, and based on sort of what's available to you. So don't feel as though absolutely everything needs to be scholarly, especially if it's an important point. We'd rather you cite work that's grey than not cite it at all and fall into sort of plagiarism problems. So
yeah, definitely. Literature review dating.
Yeah, so how far back should the literature be dated? That depends on your field. It depends entirely on what is relevant to you. So that's a really difficult thing to ask or to answer sort of from a broad perspective. So we would suggest talking to sort of a senior academic. We're looking at other articles on the topic and seeing sort of where the literature ends up being sort of dated in terms of that. So.
Yeah, as a broad sweep, if the basic tenets of your field have been well established, in the 30s or something, then you probably don't need to cover those. Yeah. It'll be more the up-to-date stuff on that. Sample sizes, quant versus qual, that was minimums, wasn't it?
We answered that one. And then the master's thesis abstract, can you submit that? I would say no, because you should be transforming your thesis into a distinct article. And as I discussed earlier, you really need to be thinking about your abstract as a standalone piece that's associated with your article. So if you're submitting your master's dissertation abstract, it probably isn't going to cut it for what your article will be saying. So I would say don't skip that step. Just rewrite the abstract after you've finished your article, and you'll do a lot better, I think.
Yeah, and bear in mind that master's theses are usually 15,000 words. That's probably a bit long for a journal article. So rather than just trying to cut, the advice I've received, when trying to do the same thing with my work, is just rewrite. To be honest, you can use the same ideas. It could be basically the same paper, but you are trying to make a new article rather than just reducing down. The same thing goes for PhD chapters. really. So theoretically, like the literature review chapter of your PhD could become an article, but you will need to think about the journal that you're submitting it to. And usually just submitting chapters wholesale is going to get you desk rejected. Yeah, so that was most of those. Are there any others?
New ones.
So there's one, how do you make sure that you've read what you need to? God, that's a tricky question, right? You should be probably trying to keep up to date. So there are loads of keeping up to date type services available. You can get table of contents alerts from the journals in your field. If they're published from a major publisher, that'll usually happen. Smaller publishers will do it in different ways. Systematic note keeping is probably really important. Using keyword searches on major databases for your area. So Scopus would be one example, but like EBSCO or JSTOR or something. Any other? I mean, to be honest, it's kind of about being organized in your work. Is sort of the answer there.
Yeah. Is it okay
So,
that I have many reference? I'm going to the new questions.
Yeah. Sure.
Is it okay that I have many reference from other different disciplines? Absolutely.
Totally fine.
That means that you have a good home with SSHO, because we are completely interdisciplinary. So that's completely acceptable for us. Of course, it might not be in a very disciplinary journal, but for us, that's totally fine. Yeah, we're okay with that. Conference proceedings, we've talked about. Good abstract with local wisdom, it's sort of just the same steps that you do for any other abstract. So making sure that your results are represented in a distinct way.
Can I repeat the code certificate? Yes, it's YYQPPX, and it's there on the announcement on the right-hand side of the screen as well.
Many of these are repeats, but we did get one interesting one that says, what if all of our hypotheses are rejected? We will accept your paper, actually, because we are interested in publishing negative results. So if you have hypotheses that were all rejected, please do write up your article, talk about obviously why you think that was, but you can submit that, and we're interested in publishing negative results as well. Great. So I think if we've missed, do we accept short communication? And we also had a question about lengths of articles. So short communications, so anything under sort of 1,000 words, I would say no, those don't tend to make it through the peer review process. Our full-length article, we're expecting anything between 8,000 to 10,000 words. So that is generally what we're looking for. Some very quantitative work, so economists don't tend to write 10,000 word papers very often. So there is some variation based on discipline, but anything that is very, very short generally wouldn't make it through the desk process with us.
Yeah, couple of other ones. Sorry, what was I going to say? On ethical approvals, got a couple of questions about, do we have to send the IRB approval through? I mean, if you have it, there's no harm, but we don't request it as mandatory as a submission item. But generally, if we have any concerns or questions that we want to follow up on, then we'll ask you for it on that. There was one other, there was a couple of questions about, is there financial support for independent researchers? So if you're an independent researcher, the same rules apply if you're based in the country. So with the Research for Life affiliations that I mentioned before, if you're an independent researcher in those countries, then that will apply in the same way. If, however, you're in a high income country, then there is no official support for that, but you're welcome to make inquiries with us, but there is no kind of blanket policy on that. And there will be a recording available. So if you go to the Researcher Academy website with the link where you registered, the recording is there alongside the copy of the slides and some links to some other resources that might be useful. I think we've answered everybody's questions. Yeah, and we've kept you all quite a long time. So yeah, thank you all so much for coming and for listening. And any further questions, just feel free to get in touch.
Yes, yeah, feel free free to email us at the editorial inbox. So it's sshoeditorial@elsevier.com. Is it? Yeah.
Yes, it is that.
No, but I don't send them to there. So it's sshoeditorial@elsevier.com. So any specific questions that you didn't have answered in this Q&A, or specific questions about articles that you'd like to send, feel free to email us. We're around, so we'll be happy to receive any inquiries from there.
Great. Thank you all so much. We will end there. Bye-bye.
Bye.